Welcome everyone to this very special Raisina panel focused on technology called Y2K to the Quad Moment, Coding the Next Leap Forward. My name is Rich Verma. I'm the head of Global Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs for MasterCard, and previously I served as the US Ambassador to India from 2014 to 2017. I want to thank ORF and the MEA and all the sponsors for making this event happen. For many of us, Raisina 2020 was the last time we actually got on an international flight. And we are hoping things can return to normal soon and have us all back meeting with one another in person. But again, our organizers have done a terrific job in responding to the current situation. Now, this panel focuses on some timely and important topics. Can technology, innovation, the digital economy define the US-India relationship over the coming years? Can we deliver and build the infrastructure and reduce, if not eliminate, the digital divide, all while protecting consumers' rights, rights to privacy, rights to information, rights to speak out? It's a complex mix. I particularly love this Y2K to Quad framework as well, as that focuses on the last 20 years, which has seen a surge in US-India ties in almost every area. But we're also not going to do much looking back. This is a panel about the future, about the promise, about the risks of building true information societies and digital economies and working together in that pursuit. We have a terrific panel, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to do the super abbreviated intro of each of them. Today, we are joined by Mr. Rajiv Chandrasekhar, a technology entrepreneur and member of parliament, representing the state of Karnataka, serving in his third term in the Rajya Sabha. Sir, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Ms. Meenakshi Lekhi is a member of parliament from New Delhi, a prominent Supreme Court lawyer and chair of the Joint Committee on the Personal Data Protection Bill. Ma'am, it's an honor for you to join us as well.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Jane Hall-Lute, my former Obama administration alum and batchmate and former Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, a diplomat, Army officer, and so much more, and now the CEO and president of SICPA North America. It's always great to see you, and thanks for all your contributions to US-India ties and to Raisina each year and to ORF. Mr. Ajit Pai is the former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, a really, really big job. He served 2 terms on the FCC. Ajit is a distinguished lawyer with stints at the Department of Justice, the US Senate, and the private sector too. A real trailblazer and someone I've known for a while, and it's great to be connected with him again through this Raisina panel.
Thank you, Ambassador.
And Mr. Ajit Mohan is the Vice President and Managing Director of Facebook India, one of the leading technologists in India and a powerful voice for using technology for the good of human development. He's got a much longer resume, former CEO and president, which I'll skip over, and only to say thank you for being here. It's been an honor to get to know you, Ajit, the last few years as well.
Great to be here.
So folks, let's just jump right in, and I'm going to use this frame of US and India building a digital economy together and get right to the questions. So Mr. Chandrasekhar, I'll start with you. You've been on the business side and now you're a lawmaker. How important is India's move to the digital economy, and how can the US and India work together in this pursuit to drive innovation, development, prosperity, and security?
So, Ambassador Mathur, so thanks for having me and thanks for the question. Look, I think anybody who's observed India knows that the digital economy part of the Indian economy is something that is very, very important to how we grow. It's a very important part of the stack up in terms of the economic pie, if you want to call it that. But more than that, Digital India also is transforming the way the government is functioning and delivering benefits and subsidies to the people. So even from a point of view of democracy, functioning of the government, Digital India is important. But since your question is aimed at the business part of it, let me just say this, that Digital India is very important for India, and it's going to be $1 trillion piece of our economic pie going forward. But the most important piece that is now emerging clearly from India's point of view is the waking up of the US and other countries to the fact that the whole technology piece needs to be seen as a strategic piece, as more than just innovation and economics and prosperity. And in your question, you say innovation, development, prosperity, and security. And I think that waking up to that realization that the ownership of the internet, the control of the internet, the technologies of the future have to be co-owned by, co-developed by, co-mentored by democracies like India and the US is the important realization that I think people are waking up to post this COVID crisis. And I think it's so going forward, I would just leave it by saying this, that it's not just about innovation and development that both our countries want to expand. Of course we do. But it's also about evolving a model of cooperation and management of the future of technology and management of the future of the internet, so that the ownership, in a sense, I use the word ownership very loosely because, as Ajit knows, there's nobody who owns the internet, but the broad ownership and mentoring of the internet remains with open societies, with the ability of most citizens of the world to have access to those technologies. That is an important aspect that we need to be thinking about as we speak about innovation, as we speak about artificial intelligence, as we speak about all of these other emerging technologies. So I think, yes, Digital India is very, very critical, but also evolving a more cooperative model to deciding the future of, or in a sense, regulating the future of technology is as important in my mind.
I really appreciate your focus on the strategic and the security elements, and you know the U.S. well. You've studied in the U.S. You've done a lot here with the U.S. over the years, so I appreciate that framework. Miss Lute, I just maybe building on that answer by Rajiv. You know, India, the U.S., Japan, Australia recently met and announced a new technology and standards working group as part of the Quad, this new architecture for the Indo-Pacific, maybe not so new. Just wonder if you could say a little bit about, is that the right grouping? Is this a big opportunity? And do we risk ignoring the bilateral partnership if we're working solely in the Quad on technology?
No, thanks, Richard. And I think this does build on what Rajiv was just saying. I mean, there are three important things to remember about the Quad. Number one is China. Number two is the US-India bilateral relationship. And number three is the importance of multilateralism for solving global problems that really lie beyond the capacity of any government to handle. So specifically, I don't think that the Quad, which is an important grouping, as you said, not the only grouping, and it has been criticized as well. Some are worried that it might become the Asian NATO. I'm less fearful of that, quite frankly, because the dynamics of the region are so different, and the dynamics of the US-India partnership is different as well. The US, as you well know, Rich, has been looking to broaden its dialogue with India well beyond security, and into some of the other issues that Rajiv touched on. And indeed, the Quad's recent communique highlighted the cooperation of the four on vaccines and combating COVID, on climate, which is critical to all of us, and where there really is common cause among both between the developed countries and the developing countries, where imbalances and inequities, frankly, have too long been in the forefront and really are being addressed. So I think this is a powerful mechanism. With respect to the question of technologies, this really is a shot across the bow on Huawei and to China. There's I think no misreading that at all. But there's also a clear search for some global framework, whether it's standards, whether it's an approach to technology sharing or development. And there's a lot of dialogue going on about this, and the Quad's an important contribution to that dialogue.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and we'll build on that as we go here. Mr. Pai, I'm going to turn back to you, maybe back to the U.S. a little bit. There's a lot of talk these days about building infrastructure, particularly digital infrastructure, and questions now about, do we need it? What does it entail? And then maybe I can redirect it back to this panel. Can the U.S. and India actually work on that endeavor together? And How would we do that? What does success look like? Just talk about that in your own words, if you don't mind.
Well, happy to do so. First and foremost, thank you for moderating this panel, and thank you to ORF for hosting this dialogue. To me, the pandemic in the United States, and I dare say in India as well, has ended any debate about whether access to digital infrastructure technologies like broadband internet access is a luxury or a necessity. I think it's a necessity for people to be able to do telework, to educate their kids, to participate in telehealth, and to do all of the other things that access to the internet allows. And here in the United States, we've made it a priority across administrations to close what we call the digital divide, that gap between those people who have access to the internet and those who don't. There are two basic ways to do that. One is through changing your regulatory framework to maximize the business case for private sector actors to raise capital, hire work crews, and build internet infrastructure. And the other one is through direct public subsidies. Here in the US, we have something called the Universal Service Fund, for example, that directs about $8 to $10 billion a year to broadband providers to subsidize those parts of the country where private capital otherwise wouldn't do the job. And I actually think there's a huge amount of symbiosis between both the challenges and the opportunities the United States and India have faced. In fact, my last major trip before the pandemic was to India, where I spoke with members of the TRAI, with the Prime Minister's office, including the Prime Minister himself, about how we could work together. Because when you think about it, when it comes to digital infrastructure, the challenge in serving a rural part of Kansas is no different than serving the rural part of Karnataka. You've got a dispersed population, relatively lower incomes than big cities, and you will find businesses finding it very challenging to lay optical fiber or provide wireless service and the like. And so I think some of the different regulatory tools in the toolbox that we can use here in the United States could be duplicated in India. And I'll just piggyback on something Rajiv said about the macro perspective. It's obviously important from a micro perspective for individual consumers, but from a macro perspective, to the extent that the US and India can move forward together in closing the digital divide, advancing leadership in 5G, that has a first mover advantage that allows countries like ours to gain some of the benefits, economic and security-wise, that otherwise would redound to the benefit of non-aligned countries. So I think even building that infrastructure is critical for consumers and for our countries as well.
Yeah, it's an exciting time, and hopefully governments and the private sector can respond, and hopefully respond together. And it's a good segue, Ms. Lakey, if I could turn to you, back to India as part of Digital India. The Prime Minister has set this goal of creating a $1 trillion digital economy by 2025. I wonder if you could give us your assessment on what more needs to be done to bring a vision into reality as part of this transformation. And there's a lot of companies, individuals, and frankly, governments wondering, can they be a partner with India? How do we fit into that story?
So I would say that thanks, Richard, about this particular question, because when we are talking about New India or taking India forward, this becomes a relevant question that can we go forward and get ahead of some of our neighbors, or at least compete with them without digitization process. So answer is quite clearly no. We need to put in this infrastructure in place, and nothing more than COVID pandemic has shown us that the way forward is through this route. But for achieving this route, the route is slightly treacherous in terms of investment. It's heavy on investment, and access to internet becomes very, very important. So BharatNet is one which is a scheme launched by the Government of India, then Gram Panchayats through PM Vani, and internet needs to be offered through public distribution officers, so that some kind of equitable mechanism is in existence. But the other side of the problem is that digitization has also shown us our vulnerability. So there have been all kind of illegal activities, cyber thefts, etc., a loss of money, loss of income. MSME sector, if needs to be formalized, a whole lot of them who are not exposed to net, they have to be exposed to it. So that needs to be worked at. And in addition, the supply chain mechanism. So when we are discussing Quad, we are discussing sovereign nations, we are discussing amongst the democratic nations. And the biggest threat, of course, is the sovereignty of each and every one of us. And that sovereignty is threatened by some countries in the world, and one country in particular, which is a major role-playing country when it comes to global supply chain. And that global supply chain, we saw what can happen if one ship gets stuck physically in Suez Canal for 1 week, 7 days, what kind of mayhem can be caused. And if you don't get microchips to other software parts in electrical supply systems, you know what all can happen. And thus, building on each one of us capacity, India has a huge capacity in terms of production because we have skilled manpower, we have great many resources, and technically sound democratic environment. Uh, what we don't have, where I think US must face up to the credit of building China. And your own report of 87, 89 shows that it was none other than US which transferred its technology, knowing very well that a nuclear country which has got different ways of working, and yet the entire supply chains were shifted to that place, and the world is facing the music because of that. So I think some sort of investment in democracies need to be made so that sovereignty of that country is protected. At the same time, business models accordingly are changed. And I would say, as an Indian, and most of you have a long-standing Indian connections, you worked at some stage or the other with India, you know it's still easy to work with India, and it's a long-term investment which you're putting in for mutual benefit. I think US has to rethink on those strategies and think in terms of production-linked incentive schemes, etc., which government is willing to offer. And thus, this particular issue can be handled better amongst all of us. And I'm back to the kind of problem I could get into.
All the tech issues, but we understand. It may not surprise. Right. It may not surprise you that I have a slightly different take of the U.S. role in Asia over the last 20 plus years. I suspect other colleagues might. I mean, I guess I see the U.S. role as providing incredible security and stability to our friends and partners over many years. And frankly, I think more companies wanted to come to India 20 years ago and 25 years ago, but the business conditions were not right. So again, not too much looking back. We'll try to look forward.
Way forward.
Mr. Mohan, I've heard you speak before about Facebook as a platform for inclusion and development. How does that happen? And how important is this bridge to the digital divide? If you can talk about that, please.
Sure, Rich. And if I can first address, I think, the theme of the forum itself, and just to add to what everyone is saying here, I do want to kind of highlight that in the context of collaboration, there is nothing more relevant than the idea of keeping the internet open where the US and India can work together. I think democracies will have to decide the future of the internet, and in particular, US and India. And I do believe that it's an explosive opportunity for the two countries to work together. And a lot of the classical models of trade that has influenced the debate over the last few decades may not be relevant here. It is not the classic import-export model. I think there's going to be a lot of fluidity. And I think the opportunity for the two countries is for non-linear returns from collaboration where ideas originate from product managers and companies and engineers in India that explode in the US and vice versa. But all of that can happen only, I believe, if the two countries work together to establish what does it mean to continue the construct of an open, productive internet that we have seen in the last 20, 25 years. And then, Rich, to the question that you were asking on inclusion, I think a lot of the role that companies like ours can play, Rich, is really around two or three things. One, in many ways, in India and in many parts of the world, we happen to be the first entry point to the internet. So our opportunity is to make that entry point easy and accessible, and make sure that we are solving overtly through design to break the gender divide, not just in terms of access to the internet, but also in making sure that there is no bias in our products that keeps some groups away. That could be gender, it could be other characteristic. Second is, in many ways, we have all taken this for granted, but there is power in building models that are free. And I think one of the parts of the internet is you have access to these extraordinary tools that hundreds of millions of consumers are not paying for and yet can derive a lot of value from, whether to build their community, whether to power ideas or to build businesses. And therefore, the last role for us, Rich, is to make sure that we are investing in efforts to make sure that people know how to take advantage of it, while at the same time, I think to what Ms. Lakey mentioned, that we are investing to make sure that that experience is safe and that we are reducing harm as much as possible.
Excellent. And really important points about the free and open internet, democracies deciding the way forward, eliminating that bias and making sure people have the tools and skills to actually access that free and open internet. Let me shift gears a little bit about how we do this and whether regulating or not is in the cards and how to build this common framework. And Ms. Lakey, you're perfectly suited to talk to us about this, given your leadership role in India's data privacy bill. And maybe you could just tell us what the goal of the bill is. Is there a risk that India becomes an outlier in how it manages and regulates data?
So I would say that for any bill, any country, any sovereign country makes has to be in the interest of that country, to protect the interest of its citizens, to protect its integrity, to protect its own businesses. And so far as being an outlier is concerned, I think we already are outliers, aren't we? 1.3 billion people, digitization process, booming economy. We are outliers compared to any other country. And having demographic dividends, being a democratic nation, opportunity and opportunity and opportunity. So we are outliers. So protecting the interests of these very people who are outliers in the first place cannot make me an outlier. And
is there no commonality? I understand that your job is to fight for the interests of the Indian people, no question about it. But are their interests not better served if they have a common framework with their friends in Europe or North America or other parts of Asia?
No. In fact, there is no debate on that subject. The commonality of interest needs to be protected, but at what cost? Now, 5G needs to be rolled out, but should that be expedited at the cost of national security or sovereignty? Answer is no, absolutely no. So there are no choices. Things have to be taken forward, but the pace has to be decided in protecting the interest of the country. Whether it's hardware or software, interests of this country need to be protected. And when interests of a democratic country are being protected, that doesn't make that country an outlier in that aspect. And being an outlier now, obviously, as corporates are looking for their, for them, the only interest is how to increase their share value. That is the interest of a corporate and nothing more than that. But as a politician working for my country, my interest would be that, okay, you make your money, you make your pie, no problem. But as long as the interest of people who I represent are getting protected simultaneously. So there is not one versus the other. It's all together. And outlier, again, I'm going back to the issue of China. So if there is one country which in the whole world which is the biggest outlier happens to be China, everybody seems to be dealing with that country because it's in their interest to deal with it. And less said the better. I mean, I think the duplicity of interest is what I keep looking at. And the duplicity of interest is while they would not allow Facebook or Google or others to enter their country, but whatever money they make, they would control their boards by investing in those countries, those companies. So how an outlier works in the system or uses the system to protect their own interest is something for all of us to learn from and think about.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Mohan, I think you may have a different view of the role that corporates play in India and around the world, but you also said recently, if I understood a recent interview, you said that you'd be open to new regulation and laws in this space. Maybe you could say a little bit about what that looks like or would entail.
Yeah, and I want to call out two areas where I vehemently agree with Ms. Lakey. I think one is the idea of India as an outlier when you look at the last few years and the explosive shift in access to the internet and the emergence of entirely new models that have come on the back of that expanded access. I agree with Ms. Lakey that there isn't any other country that has managed to do so much in so short a period of time. And second, I actually agree with Ms. Lakey that one of the overwhelming objectives should be to protect the interests of people in India and users on the internet. I'm hoping that she believes me when I say that as much as our objective as a private company is to look out for shareholders, I absolutely believe that our mission in India is to be an ally for the country and to be a very positive force for good in India's transformation, not just over the next 5-10 years, but for the next few decades, because we believe that we have had the opportunity to operate in India, and part of our mission is to make sure that we are an ally for the country. And I think, Rich, to your question, we absolutely do believe that the internet needs new rules, not just in India, but around the world. We operated for a very long time with not enough clarity on the traffic lights. And this is the moment when we should think, especially in democratic societies, think about how do we navigate complex issues where there are competing trade-offs. And out of that, I'm hoping that we can emerge with a very forward-looking and positive regulatory framework. I can think of three areas, and we have had the opportunity to go in front of Ms. Lakey's committee, and Mr. Chandrasekhar has been a part of those to present our views. But I can give you three examples, Rich. One is transparency mandates, right? Make it the companies to be more transparent about how data is used. Second, there's a lot of concern about algorithms and how machines are controlling people's lives. I think we would be very keen to lean in and say, how do we protect user agency, where people have the opportunity to make explicit choices that drive algorithms, right? Data portability. I think a lot of the conversation has been about how large tech companies benefit from large sets of data. I think we have been very forward in saying we are open to creating frameworks that still protect the interests of privacy and safety when data moves around, but make it easier for users to move data between competing platforms. So I do believe that we are a partner in this, but I agree with the framework that we need rules, and we hope those will be forward-looking and positive.
Great. Thank you very much. Mr. Pai, you've got direct, relevant experience in this area, recent experience, big, high-profile battles, really. And the tendency will be for lawmakers and government officials as the technology moves faster to regulate. I just wonder how you struck that balance as FCC chair. You hear Mr. Mohan saying new rules of the road are required. Ms. Lakey and Mr. Chandrasekhar are moving aggressively in that direction. How do you strike that balance?
It's a very good question. I appreciated their thoughtful comments about it. To me, the question is not so much whether to regulate as much as when. And what I mean by that is that government, as it sees a marketplace, can act in one of two ways. It can act preemptively to preemptively regulate an entire ecosystem, to say that we predict that this market is going to result in failure, or it's fundamentally a natural monopoly, or there are other structures to it that require us to put on the page rules in advance that apply to every single company. But the other approach is after the fact, more post hoc, if you will, to let dynamic marketplaces evolve and then to take targeted action based on antitrust or competition laws in terms of consumer protection. And to me, at least, I think everybody agrees in terms of those bedrock values of consumer protection, promoting innovation, ensuring competitive markets. But those two different models of preemptive versus after the fact regulation have serious differences when it comes to digital infrastructure. And to me, at least, when you're talking about digital infrastructure, we're talking about a proposition that involves very high upfront capital expenditures. It costs a lot to build the internet infrastructure in each of our countries, for example. There's a tremendous amount of risk. In many cases, they're very competitive marketplaces. Number two, we need to make sure that over time we're not treating the entire marketplace as fundamentally broken. And so the more after the fact targeted action, I think, is better calibrated in most cases to ensure that we have consumer protection in competitive markets. Now, there are two important exceptions to that general view that I've just expressed. Number one is national security. When I was chairman of the FCC, we took the novel action of prohibiting any money that was distributed by the FCC to private companies in the US from being spent by US companies on equipment from Huawei and ZTE, because our national security and our intelligence community had come to the FCC and said, those two companies, along with a few others, present a serious national security risk. And so here, preemptively, we thought it's not enough to say we're building these 5G networks at scale. Let's just incorporate whatever equipment and services companies want. We wanted to make sure that we were secure from the get-go. And the second type of consumer protection I think should be preemptive is building on Rajiv's very learned answer, transparency. Whether it is a tech platform like Facebook or Google, or it's a network operator like Comcast or AT&T, consumers deserve to know the rules of the road, how these algorithms are operating, how the networks operate, what they're getting for their money or for the service. And there, at least, that's a better way of shining a light without heavy-handed upfront regulation, just making sure that consumers and policymakers can better understand what's at stake. So that's generally speaking how I see the world and how I think both India and the United States can accelerate digital infrastructure while protecting consumers.
Yeah, I think really important points and an important framework. Jane, maybe just turn back to you, and you've heard the India approach, you've heard Ajit's view about a possible framework, but is there a possibility of reaching a bit of a consensus beyond our two countries on these issues? How do you do that? How do you get a global consensus? What are the forums for doing that? For example, even around data, can we get to a more global framework?
So what an interesting conversation, Rich, and thanks. And I can't help but comment on a slight difference of views, I guess, that I have with respect to the business community and expectations regarding regulation, and then this whole question of common cause internationally on this. I mean, the group of government experts, the GGE, has had its requiem played more than once over the course of its life. I mean, it still is in existence. India and the United States are both members, as are 23 other countries as well, with individuals who serve in their individual capacity. And this is an effort not only to affirm, this group found and has since tried to continue to affirm the relevance of international law for the governance of cyberspace and the internet and interaction. And of course, we know telecommunications law has gone back to the 19th century, where governments have come together and to form some rules of the road and standards for telecommunications, including, by the way, acknowledging the need for espionage between them and among them for purposes of national security. Which tends to be a wand that's waved, not that Ajit Pai was waving it, but it is, as a member of the national security community, I can tell you it's a wand we waved whenever we think that there are real dangers that might not have been foreseen by the commercial community or by the private sector that we can clearly see, because as we know, technology is a two-edged sword. I think, you know, for example, I was part, and Samira Asaran also was part, a number of us were part of a global public-private partnership called the GCSC, the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, designed to elaborate norms for the protection of ourselves in cyberspace with respect to non-interference in the public core, the non-interference in domestic plebiscites and other areas where there ought to be common cause among nations. But let's face it, countries really fall into one of three categories. There are those who perceive the threat in cyberspace coming from outside their borders, penetrating in. There are those who fear threats within their borders that have been facilitated by access to the internet and communications and others. And then there are those who are not particularly bothered by threats, but see an awful lot of money changing hands, and don't feel as though governments are getting their fair share of it. I'm not as sanguine as Ajit is regarding the tendency for greater regulation, although I think it is judiciously needed. But what you see in the United States, at least, and this is my final point, is a business community that feels at the moment it is without a political party. They don't feel as though the traditional Republican, conservative, business-friendly party is intact and there for them anymore. And they feel, in many ways, that the Democratic Party is hostile. It's pro-consumer, pro-worker, pro-tax, pro-regulation, and business is reacting predictably to that. I think the same is not far away in India, although the political dynamic is different. So is there opportunity for government-to-government dialogue to continue? Absolutely. But I think here, this is where the private sector needs to step up and take on more of the responsibilities that the power they wield suggests they should have.
Important points. Rajiv, again, you've got that private sector background and now in the public sector, but maybe just back to the role that India can play in setting the way forward in the Indo-Pacific and beyond, in building this digital economy. And again, this risk of fragmentation of India having a different standard while it tries to be this leader in the Indo-Pacific and beyond.
Yeah, so Ambassador Verma, I just want to take up from where Meenakshi led off. I think to characterize India as an outlier is another way of saying India has to take the lead. Essentially, we are the largest connected democracy in the world. We have 800 million people, soon to be 1 billion people, all on the internet. And we have an obligation, as Meenakshi said, to protect these consumers and give them the right to access a fair, open internet. So obviously, I think India will take the lead, not so much for global good as much for its own good and for the good of its own consumers. So, if you want to characterize that as an outlier, so be it. But India, I prefer to think of this as India taking the lead. And for example, just recently we took the lead in how to regulate digital media. And everywhere around the world, people are all, in a frenzy about how do we regulate big tech, how do we regulate digital media. These are all unregulated, and we've taken a reasonably measured step in terms of regulating digital media, without necessarily calling it regulation. So it's self-regulation, but with a sense of obligations that vest in these platforms to their consumers. So leaving that to one side, Ambassador Verma, this is an important point that you make. This question is an important question. And I have had the privilege of working on the internet in the early days when it was all very utopian. It was all about connecting individuals all around the world. I was in the Valley in the late 80s and early 90s, and this was, it was all great and fun and nice. And then came along the Facebooks and the Twitters and all of these guys who decided the internet is going to be these big islands and not so much about direct access of these consumers to the internet. No offense, Ajit, but that's just the way it is. So to make an argument that the internet needs regulation or the intermediaries on the internet needs regulation is a slam dunk argument. I think there is nobody on this planet who will contest the logic of the government playing a role, because the government has lagged the private sector all these years. Governments have lagged the private sector all these years in framing these rules. In terms of the approach of regulation, yes, I agree with what Ajit said. I don't think it has to be heavy-handed regulation. I don't think you need policemen of the internet. There has to be an approach like Ajit says, which is the other Ajit says, which is that we frame clear, precise rules, have obligations on the part of these intermediaries to their consumers, and we evolve a more rule-based internet where these players can grow, but at the same time they have to abide by certain obligations to their consumers. I will just add one last point to what Jane said about And this goes back to what you said, Ambassador Verma, about how do we harmonize the basic legislative frameworks that are emerging in India with the rest of the world's existing framework. And I think this will remain as an issue unless the democracies of the world can create some institutional capacity, some kind of an organization that is on an ongoing basis talking about the future of technology, the future of regulation, future of laws, and creating some sort of a permanent institution that is engaged across geographies. Because right now, it's almost left to individual countries and individual sovereigns to see whether they need to harmonize their laws with, let's say, the EU or the US. But having something much more institutionalized, and this is one of the things that I've been screaming hoarse for the last several years, that it's not enough to keep saying quad, 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 quad when four people meet occasionally in Tokyo, USA, Delhi, over a cup of coffee and talk about how many ships you want to sail in the Indian Ocean. I think this has to get into a little bit more institutionalized mechanism where we are talking technology, we are talking trade, we are talking security, and talking about this in a way of talking meaningful milestones that countries can achieve amongst themselves. So yes, there is a need for harmonization, but don't blame India for not being the outlier. We will do what we have to do. And, I think the nations of the world will have to figure out how we create an institutional mechanism to keep lockstep with in terms of where we want to go and how we want to go.
Yeah, no, Rajiv, thank you. Thank you for those points. And I just want to maybe just one quick follow-up. You mentioned that regulation is a bit of a slam dunk here. And, I go back to something Ms. Lakey said about, the interests of the corporates are just about shareholders. Now, if you make the counter argument, are the interests of the political officials just about politics? And are you regulating because you're upset about what the platforms are broadcasting? And so do you get into that challenge about who's really pure, who's got the purer story here?
No. This is not a purity test at all, Ambassador Verma. This is absolutely not a purity test at all, because we are now moving into a regime where these platforms, which have escaped any form of regulation, are coming under some regulation. And I don't mean, and I'm very clear, me and Meenakshi will differ on the fact that shareholder value is a bad thing. I don't think she means that. But I have absolutely no problem with Facebook making a lot of money, Twitter making a lot of money, MasterCard, anybody making money. But doing so, playing to a set of rules that protect the consumers and give corresponding reciprocal rights to the consumers is an important aspect of any democracy. And I think that is where we're moving. We're going from a zero to a regime where there will be some consumer rights and some framework of regulation. I don't mean to say that this will be a new cop walking around and hauling up Ajit Mohan every time he has to do something. That's clearly not what I intend. This is modern light touch regulation that allows the consumers and the governments to seek a form of accountability from these platforms in terms of the conduct. And there is a backstory to that, Ambassador Verma. You know what's happening around the world. There is clearly outrage about the powers, an unaccountable concentration of power of these platforms. And there is a need to reset that a little bit. And I don't believe it has to be through a stick alone, but a carrot, stick, and some amount of persuasion. I like the word persuasion.
Yeah. I know, Ms. Lakey, you wanted to come in here, and I just want to flag, we've got about 10 minutes left, but go ahead very, very quickly if you don't mind.
So taking it forward from where Rajiv left, and you know the rules of engagement. In any democratic country, there is a regulation, there is a set of rules by which anybody is welcome to play by the rules. You can't have free for all. So you can't be abusive towards me, my community, country, and then carry on doing the business. That's not permitted. So you cannot show the flag of India and show parts of it in China and say, I want to do business in India. That cannot be permitted. And not just that, you cannot sell my data because that is not what I signed up for. You cannot be stealing my data. You cannot be recording me when I have not signed it up for. So you cannot have AIs which are not forming, not in line with the regulation. So fair AI is something which we all look forward to. When we say accountability, fairness in business, transparency, theft, these are communal harmony, so on and so forth. These are regulations which exist in real life. Now, you cannot have internet where these regulations are not in place, because these are regulations which are needed for any core sovereign function. So sovereign functions are primarily the functions of a state, and they cannot be played up with, because you say that you as a corporate are beyond any regulation. That cannot be the rule in any democratic country. Consumer protection is one such thing, but when I sign up for any of the platforms, I sign up for a particular service. I am not signing up that when I buy an equipment without my knowledge, without my authority, that app or that equipment is spying on me. I don't want that. Now, these regulations are very much a part of any national regulation. And who is going to protect if not the sovereign state? And if sovereign state is not going to protect, why do I need a sovereign state then?
Yeah, no, it's a powerful point. I think, and I think you've heard from Mr. Mohan, not in opposition to the regulation. I guess I'm thinking to other analogous situations. You know, if you get on a plane in India and you fly anywhere in the world, you know there's going to be a common landing procedure. You know there's going to be common security protocols. You know how you communicate to the operating tower, regardless of what city you go to, is common, and you have set basic standards for passenger safety. I'm just wondering if we can ever get to a model like that on how we cooperate on the internet, and maybe we can get there.
Yes,
Again, I said we got about 10 minutes. Jane, I'll turn it back to you just in this final section on opportunities and risks. You've spent a lot of time on cybersecurity. There's a lot of malign actors out there, nation states, individuals, operators. What can we do, our two countries together, to make this a safer platform, safer place to be as we operate?
Thanks, Rich, and what a great conversation. I think the risks really revolve around three questions. Now, question number one is, how do we architect systems we can trust from components we can't? And this is as much about the business case for productivity as it is about Ms. Lekti's case for consumer protection. How do we architect systems we can trust from components we can't? And how do we understand the economy of trust, therefore? Second question, how do we safeguard the integrity of our information and our identity in an open data exchange? And I'm all for data portability. And can someone please call Google and Apple and get those calendars to play nice in the sandbox, as a first step? I mean, but how do we safeguard the integrity, not just our privacy? I mean, my blood type is A positive, as the president of Estonia used to say, not his type. He said, I don't care if you know my blood type. I do care if you can change it. And that's data integrity. And that's wrapped up in privacy. It's wrapped up in trust. It's wrapped up in all these things. And the third question is, so if question one is, how do we architect systems we can trust from components we can't? Question two, how do we safeguard the integrity of our information and our identities in an open internet exchange? And question number three, which this panel has been talking about, what should the role of government be? And frankly, when it comes to security, I think the national security model is not apt. National security is strategic, centralized, and top-driven. I can't think of three more useless words in the English language to describe what's going on in the internet than strategic, centralized, and top-driven. We need a transactional, decentralized approach. We don't have soldiers on every street corner in the United States or in India. We have functioning police departments. We have a functioning citizenry that knows its role and responsibilities. We need a different model and approach.
Jane, thank you so much. Ajit, Mohan, a lot's been put on the table, and obviously, Facebook in the spotlight for so many different reasons: the enormous success, the enormous popularity, but also some of your own challenges. And I just wonder what you want to say about the steps that you've taken to protect your users, and how it's going, and again, what more needs to be done as a set of closing comments.
Sure, Rich. Three things here, Rich. One, while accepting the need for new rules. And I agree with you that um, uh, it'll be helpful to have an interoperable framework, given the nature of the internet. I know it won't be consistently uniform, but at least it makes sense to be interoperable. I think as a company, if I look at it, a lot of our efforts over the last few years have been on addressing exactly what you said. How do we invest in people and systems to make sure that harmful content doesn't get distributed on our platform, that users have greater control, and honestly, I think the company has been leaning in on safety and security to make sure that some of the harm that Ms. Lakey and Mr. Chandrasekhar spoke about is reduced to the extent possible. And I think the last point that I have to make is, and I may be an outlier on the panel on this one, uh, I do disagree about the framing of private sector companies and tech companies like ours. I don't think our objective has been to create islands. I think if you look at the history of the last 10, 15, 20 years, I know we are at a moment there is a particular scrutiny on tech companies. There are certain narratives, and I think that scrutiny is fair, but I do think there is a big gap between the narrative outside and the work that I see inside the company every day, where so much of our energy is focused on how do we make sure that we reduce harm, but equally, how do we continue to expand the canvas for people and businesses to make sure that they are able to use platforms like ours to to move from an idea to a company that has relevance around the world, to build communities. In the middle of the pandemic, I think we saw our platforms being used to make sure that people were helping each other. I think that is the story of tech as well. And I think it's important for us to recognize that even as we think about rules that reduce harm, that give clarity about how companies should behave, and I agree with that, I think we recognize that we also allow for this canvas to be present where a lot of the good that happens can continue.
Yeah, thanks, Ajit. And Rajiv, again, you've got this technology background. You've got now these public sector charges, which you're responsible for. Can you bridge this gap between policymakers and the private sector? You seem particularly well suited to do that, but there are gaps on tax, on IP, on privacy. How do you bridge the divide?
No, so let me just start by saying, or let me end by saying, start my ending by saying that I'm a complete believer, having spent 3.5 decades in technology, that the single biggest thing we have going for all of us as citizens and lawmakers and businesses around the world is the growth of our technology, the fourth industrial revolution, Internet 2.0, whatever you want to call it. We have to nurture this because this is going to be very, very important for the coming decade. So having said that, Ambassador Verma, what I think is the takeout of the conversations that we're all having and we've been having is that countries like the US and India have to evolve a framework, evolve thinking that will shepherd us into the future. And that thinking has to be built around the fact that innovation isn't a binary with personal privacy. Innovation should not be a binary with national security. Innovation should not be a binary with free speech. These are all multiple values that are important to our democracies, and we have to be able to find a way of using the word regulation or rules or whatever you want to call it. But we have to be able to find a way, evolve a way that democracies can harness technology to put it to best use, but at the same time, figure out a way of handling all of these other issues that are as important to us as free speech is, national security is, personal privacy is. And this can be done if a country like the US and a country like India can sit down less informally and more formally. I go back to the thing that we need institutions to shepherd this, help this movement, that we can do it, but this needs some heavy lifting and this needs to be done now.
Great, thank you. And we've got just 3 or 4 minutes and 2 closing comments. Ajit Pai, You've heard a lot here that's been put on the table. Great opportunities for US and India to work together in this space. What can we do? How do we make a difference to ordinary citizens in both our countries?
Well, I think certainly what you've heard in the conversation is that there will be difficulties in coming up with a regulatory framework when it comes to the content that goes over the internet. For example, how do we define data privacy? How do we protect consumers with respect to those types of issues? But I think there's a great opportunity when it comes to the network side of things, because there I think there's a commonality of interest. There's a coherence around what this shared goal is. And if I might key off one of Jane's points, she put it very well. How do we safeguard a system we can trust from components we don't? And here's a great opportunity for the United States and India to collaborate. For example, when it comes to 5G, there's been a lot of discussion about Huawei and ZTE. Well, those are essentially hardware providers that provide some of the edge, if you will, of the wireless networks, from getting to the tower to your phone. But now, because of softwareization, things like virtual radio access networks are going to be the norm in the future. And this is an area where both Indian and American entrepreneurs are leading the way. We have a real edge when it comes to software, and we have a security interest in developing those types of solutions. So the more that we can reach common interests on issues like that, I think we can create systems we can trust and leave out the components that we don't in a way that benefits our consumers and benefits our countries.
Thank you. And your voice will be critical in this as we go forward, given all your great experience. And Ms. Lakey, final words to you. India, a leader, I think, as you've described, sitting with this great opportunity with a lot of challenges, but also, a chance to really be the global leader here. Can you get there? And what do you see coming up ahead?
So I would go back to the issue of Quad countries, and which I would say that Quad countries occupy a very important place in terms of global business and global regulation and democratic framework. At the same time, this particular group works beyond the Indo-Pacific. The influence of this group is far beyond the Indo-Pacific, and for that reason, we have to move beyond just the algorithm, the software. The engagement has to be towards global supply chain, and we have to grow beyond the coercion and influence which one particular country occupies in the world of electronics and electronic manufacturing, from technologies to computers to cell phones. We have to grow beyond that, and thus to have a trusted global chain where we can innovate, work together, and answer is in collaboration. And so far as rules of engagement are concerned, I think most countries, more or less, we have this shared value system. We understand what democratic systems are all about, what is freedom of speech. Little difference here and there, but we all know what is the basic nature of freedom of speech. We all understand what is constitutionality and constitutional framework. We understand what is decent and what is indecent. Some things may differ, that this particular statement is decent or indecent as per the cultural norms, but we all understand what is the value of decency in a civil society, what is the value of good and correct behavior, what is defamation. When we all understand that framework, we all can work around it and in a cooperative manner. But bigger challenge in this entire process is the supply chain mechanism. So disengagement, over dependence on one particular country has to be moved beyond, and there has to be a closer cooperation amongst the Quad countries.
Thank you so much. Really important comments from you and from all of our panelists. We could continue this conversation for many hours. I know we'll continue to hear your voices. Your leadership on these issues is going to be critical. They're so important to both our countries, to the people in both of our countries. And again, thank you for all the work that you've each been doing. And thanks to ORF and the MEA again for putting this important panel together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.